It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Good to have you back, David.
Thank you. Good morning.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. We're going to hear from retired Colonel Larry Wilkerson.
As the hostilities between Israel and Gaza enter their third week, we enter our third week of coverage. Over the past 2 weeks, we've spoken with Israeli journalist Gideon Levy and Middle East researcher James Zogby. Today, we're addressing a question that keeps coming up. Was there any military purpose to the Israeli response to Hamas's attack? Our first guest today, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, can speak to these questions with some authority. We're hoping Colonel Wilkerson can shed a little more light on exactly what happened on October 7th, how the attack unfolded, and why it met so little military resistance. How much on either side the Hamas attack and the lack of Israeli resistance was intentional, and how much could just be chalked up to incompetence? And does it matter? After we speak to Colonel Wilkerson, we'll be joined once again by our resident constitutional scholar, Bruce Fein, who will give us some legal perspective on the international side. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our staunch corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's approach the Israeli-Gazan conflict from a military perspective. David?
Lawrence Wilkerson is a retired U.S. Army colonel and former chief of staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Colonel Wilkerson served as deputy director and director of the U.S. Marine Corps War College at Quantico, Virginia, and for 15 years he was the distinguished visiting professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. He is currently a senior fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network, senior advisor to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and co-founder of the All-Volunteer Force Forum. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Welcome indeed, Larry. You've been on the inside on the run-up to the Iraq War under George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. You were chief of staff for Colin Powell at the State Department. Give us your current view of what do you think's going to happen now and going back to October 7th.
I paint the picture this way. Picture this, if you will. You have the richest nation in the world on a per capita basis with more per capita basis billionaires than we have, Israel, backed by the richest nation in the world, heavily in debt, but still asset-wise the richest nation in the world, going against the most oppressed, repressed, poor people in the world, the Palestinians in Gaza. What's wrong with that picture?
That raises the question that Biden doesn't seem to distinguish between the subjugators and the subjugated and the colonizers of what remains of Palestinian land, 22% of the original Palestine, taking land and water and all kinds of checkpoints and blowing up houses. Factually, it's pretty clear that the difference in military superpower on the side of the Israelis and the U.S. compared to the feeble weaponry of the Palestinians, if they're even able to acquire them, is probably the greatest gap in the modern history between the occupier and the occupied. Why doesn't Biden recognize that? You know, he's supposed to be a foreign policy expert. He's been in Afghanistan many times, in Iraq and Ukraine. Why doesn't he recognize those basic facts, which unrecognized are going to lead to a massive slaughter larded with genocidal orders by the Israeli defense minister when he said no water, no food, no electricity, no gas, which are the words of annihilation and extermination.
They've reined him in a little bit. I mean, I was quoting him at Temple Emmanuel up in New York City a couple of nights ago, Rabbi Bob Woodham's congregation up there, and there were some stunned people in the audience when I quoted him, several IDF generals and so forth, but they have reined them in a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit. I compare the situation roughly to when Grant finally gave Sheridan, commander of the Army in the West, and Sherman, his Secretary of War, to go into the Black Hills for gold and to annihilate the Indians, the Native Americans. Only that was 175 plus years ago. A lot of water's passed under the bridge since then, heinous though that was. And we've had the Geneva Conventions. We've had all manner of humanitarian law and humanitarian justice, courts to enforce it, and international courts, regional tribunals, and everything else. So this is not quite the same thing, although the crime level is about the same. And the fact that the United States is allied with it is unconscionable. And secondarily, I listened in New York City in my hotel room to Biden's Oval Office address. I listened twice. I took notes. And at the end of it, one CNN commentator got it right, but they cut him off pretty quickly. What Biden was saying is there's chaos in America, Americans. I want to use the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East to unify this country, open parentheses, and get reelected, close parentheses. That, to me, was one of the most despicable presidential addresses I have ever had the misfortune to listen to.
Well, I think the listeners need to know Netanyahu's support of Hamas in the past. Hamas was a small religious organization in the 1980s, and the U.S. and Israel supported it, expanded it, funded it as a counterweight to the secular Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. But there's more to it. Recently, the New York Times on October 24th quotes Netanyahu in 2019. This is pretty astonishing. The quote in the Times is, in 2019, Mr. Netanyahu told a meeting of his center-right Likud party, and this is the quote by Netanyahu, quote, those who want to thwart the possibility of a Palestinian state should support the strengthening of Hamas and the transfer of money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy, end quote. That was 2019 by the Prime Minister then and the Prime Minister now. So what's the political intrigue here? What's going on?
It's a little more complicated, I think. I go way back with this, before Netanyahu even, with Sharon. And what's happening is a kabuki game where Bibi entices, he doesn't have to entice very much, the emir in Doha, not only as he did support the Taliban talks. One wonders why the Taliban were comfortable in Doha, one of the biggest supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, into giving hundreds of millions of dollars to Gaza, which he is ready to do for humanitarian reasons, but also to supply Hamas, because Bibi is very strategically allied with Hamas. Hamas does not believe in a two-state solution. They are adamantly opposed to a two-state solution. They want a Palestinian state and Israel gone. But Bibi sympathizes with that because he wants an Israeli state and the Palestinians gone. So he's very much willing to work with Hamas, not explicitly, but certainly tacitly and implicitly, to undermine Mahmoud Abbas, not hard to do, he's so corrupt, and the Palestinian Authority, who do indeed want a two-state solution. So Bibi's been enmeshed in this for a long time, and Sharon before him, ever since George W. Bush told Ariel Sharon in the Oval Office, I believe it was 2003 or 4, over to you, Prime Minister. Everything for the last 40 to 50 years has failed, so we're not going to do it anymore. Put the roadmap away, put two states away, put the peace solution away. It's over to you. You do whatever you want to do. Open parentheses, kill anybody you want to kill anytime you want to kill, close parentheses, and we'll support you.
Well, there seems to be an Israeli government strategy that goes beyond revenge for the massacre on October 7th. The New York Times reports over 115 health facilities have been devastated, hospitals and clinics so far. So they've already achieved revenge, but they're going further. They're pushing the population to the south, maybe trying to push into Sinai. They said to the northern Palestinians, get out of your homes, apartments, hospitals, go south. And then they started bombing the south around Khan Yunis, and even bombed the Rafah crossing into Egypt. So every place in Gaza is a target: schools, clinics, hospitals, water mains, electric networks, UN installations. They've already killed 35 United Nations staff working for UNRWA, even though the buildings are clearly marked and have been marked for years as UN buildings, and churches, mosques, you name it. So what is the strategy now beyond revenge? Is it just to clear Gaza of its population and annex it, push them in the desert?
I don't think Israel has a strategy. I think their tactics right now, and that's what I would call them, not strategic, but tactics, are to destroy as much as possible in as short a time period as possible. They've elongated it a bit, I think, from pressure from the United States, other Arab countries, and other countries in Europe. They've elongated it a bit, but they're still pretty brutal, and they're still just killing people to be killing people, really. They have no strategy, because if you sit and think about it for a moment, you ask yourself some pretty fundamental questions. If you do what you just described as a strategy, who rules Gaza afterwards? Where do these people go? Egypt won't take them. Egypt has threatened to back out of its peace treaty with Israel if they have to take too many of them. Jordan certainly won't take them. They already have more Palestinians in Jordan than they have Bedouins. So nobody's going to take them, and living in the Sinai is not a solution. So who's going to govern, and where are they going to live? They have not thought this out at all. They've just thought the brutality out, and they are busy executing that, somewhat attenuated by the fact that others are telling them, don't be so brutal. You'll lose the strategic picture to Hamas rather than winning it. And that's exactly what they're going to do if they keep on the same track. They'll lose the strategic picture. They'll destroy every relationship they had or were building with the Arab countries. And they'll wind up with a problem they can't do anything about except repeat it endlessly ad nauseum. Maybe that's what Ben-Gvir and the crowd that runs with him and Netanyahu now, because he accepted them into his government, maybe that's what they want. I mean, they were conducting pogroms in the West Bank with the settlers helping. Every day they would do something that would get a few Palestinians killed, and killed brutally in the West Bank, doing the same thing in East Jerusalem. So I have no idea what Netanyahu's goal here is: to stay out of jail. Stay out of jail. That's his real goal. And he's using...
Because of the corruption case against him. But there's also internal politics. You know, he can stifle dissent, opposition. He's already got a unity coalition with the more liberal party. And that's one way he stays in power. But Netanyahu is nothing other than a very shrewd politician. He's been around a long time. In 1976, he addressed a joint session of Congress to huge applause and standing ovation. And nothing was more louder than when he said, paraphrasing him, the Israeli economy is really doing very well now, and we're about to stop asking for U.S. aid. You got a huge standing ovation.
You're right.
And, of course, U.S. aid has continued to get bigger.
Of course.
Yeah. We're talking with retired Colonel Larry Wilkerson, a long experience in government, Chief of Staff for Colin Powell. And since he left the military, he's been a strong advocate and networker for peace and justice and end to the U.S. empire. Larry, what is the U.S. strategy here? They've sent 2 carrier task forces with destroyers to the eastern Mediterranean. One Navy veteran half seriously said the other day that they better watch out and be careful about Israeli fighters coming in on them, alluding to the Liberty attack, the attack on the U.S. Liberty in 1967 by Israel. You want to describe that?
Well, that was a horrible deed. My students have parsed over it endlessly, gone through the archives and everything else. I have no idea why the Israelis did that, but I have a suspicion that they did it intentionally, that there was no bones about it. They did it intentionally. And they did it because Liberty was very sophisticated for the times, intel ship, and she had intercepted communications between the Israeli leadership. In times of war, most people don't know this, in times of war or near war, Israel surrenders the civilian leadership to the military. They don't do like we do. Our president stays in charge throughout whatever conflict we might be in, World War II, Korea, whatever it is, our president stays in charge. Not true with Israel. They turn everything over to the generals. And what was happening was the generals were talking about some pretty nasty things, and they were talking in a way that Liberty intercepted, and that was disaster. And so the Israelis attacked the ship. Their full intent was to sink it with all hands on board. They even machine gunned some of the survivors in the water. And we covered it up. We covered it up completely. A heinous deed indeed, but we covered it up. The Navy covered it up. The Navy was forced to, and the president himself covered it up. I don't think we'll ever know the truth about it, maybe in 100 years. But yes, I'm more concerned with those carriers in terms of the following. Two things I'm really concerned about. And if we get to be 3 there, I'll be really concerned, because carrier ops cannot go on for more than 24 to 48 hours unless there are 3 carriers. Then they can go on around the clock. If we send 3 carriers there, then we're very, very concerned about China, Russia, and Iran in terms of the conflict there, but in a bigger sense. That is to say, we're going to teach them a lesson. They can't interfere when we're in our lake, the Mediterranean, with our craft, those aircraft carriers. And so we're going to teach them a lesson. This bothers me greatly, because we're going to wind up with a carrier or 2 on the bottom of the ocean with 10,000 casualties in about 10 hours. Because these carriers are okay for striking Syria or striking some country that has no real capability to come back. But with China and Russia, they'll sink a carrier or 2 in a nanosecond. It's that easy.
So what is the strategy of Biden and the Blinken Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense Austin? What is their strategy right now? Publicly, they're basically saying we're against the ceasefire, we're against the humanitarian ceasefire. They're urging Israel to abide by the laws of war. That's the quote, abide by the laws of war. And shipping ferociously all kinds of weapons, some of them having nothing to do with this particular conflict, and pushing for a $14 billion plus aid package through Congress for Israel to have the American taxpayer pay for the Israeli colossal blunders and intelligence and detection failures that rendered them unable to protect their own people on October 7th. I mean, this is what it's all about, a tremendous intelligence failure that exposed these civilians in the kibbutz and other places to the raid. What are their strategies?
Of the National Security Agency and the CIA and DIA, because we have a base in Beersheba that is state of the art. We have another base that has adequate intelligence capacity. So to tell me that Mossad and Shin Bet and the rest of the Israeli intelligence service missed this is to tell me that the United States, working hand in glove with them, with its very best and highest ranked intelligence entities, failed too. No new occurrence, of course, but no one's talking about that. What was the base in Beersheba doing? What were the other people doing? Indeed, what was the entity in this country, CIA, NSA, and so forth, doing, that they missed this completely? Are they really that stupid, incompetent?
Well, it's interesting. This low-tech attack on October 7th basically overtook the high-tech surveillance, the sensors, the detectors, the videos, the informants. It's almost inconceivable. How do you explain that? Were they all asleep at the switch?
There's 3 things that contributes to that: arrogance and hubris, lack of imagination, and thinking your enemy is subhuman. All 3 of those apply to Israel, and for that matter, they apply, I think, to the United States too. But I'm looking at it from the perspective of how could you possibly do what the Israelis did unless there was some intent there to aid and abet it? Now, I can't bring myself to conclude that yet, and I don't have the evidence to support that, so I won't. But otherwise, it's a colossal failure. And the only way I can explain it is the way I just did. Arrogance and hubris, treating your enemy as if he's subhuman and therefore incapable of anything, and the fact you lack imagination. Israelis have lacked imagination for a long time. All they think about in the IDF, for example, is occupation duty. Now, there's another possibility, and this possibility doesn't obviate the others, but it goes along with them. In 1973, 2 people talked about the failure in 73 when the Egyptians were able to do all they did initially. And one of them said this, very cogent remarks. He said, "We knew where every tank in the Egyptian army was 24/7, but we didn't know what the people in the tanks were thinking." That's a very prescient observation. They had no idea what Hamas was thinking. They thought Hamas was thinking about governing. That's the reason they helped in the election in 2006 and got Hamas elected. Netanyahu even said this. He thought Hamas would be busy governing. Well, they were not busy governing. They were busy working out the next intifada.
Here's a question the media hasn't asked, to our knowledge at least. Where did Hamas get these weapons? There's an embargo. The Israeli Navy apprehends any ships coming with weapons to Gaza. They got informants all over Gaza. They don't get these weapons in pieces and put them together into machine guns, etc. Are they getting them, as some Israeli journalists suspect, from the Israeli underworld?
Well, I can tell you this right now. If you've read Misha Glenny's book of several years ago, McMafia, they even made a TV series out of it, and Israel got it pulled off the air almost instantly. There is such a huge traffic in arms in the world. Misha estimates the black economy at this is several years ago now. This is over a decade ago, at $5 trillion. That's a lot of money. Of that $5 trillion, of course, some of it is illegal trafficking in people. Some of it is drugs and associated illicit activities. Some of it is prostitution. Some of it's auto theft. But a big portion of it, and the United States is right at the center of this, is moving arms around. Moving arms around. My own state here, Virginia Beach, is a conduit for arms going out. The NRA had a problem. National Rifle Association had a real problem with its finances recently. And I've had people associated with the NRA who've left it, subsequently left it because they hate Wayne LaPierre's guts. They have told me, they've insinuated that the NRA sometimes, in order to make money, is in on some of these less than licit weapons exchanges, especially those that go over shores. So if you're looking for somebody who's in charge of the illicit arms traffic in the world, look internally.
Well, Hamas had some pretty sophisticated technology to pull this off and to defend themselves in the tunnels, etc. Could it be that when Netanyahu told his own Likud party that, quote, those who want to thwart the possibility of a Palestinian state should support the strengthening of Hamas and the transfer of money to Hamas, this is part of our strategy, end quote, could that money have gone to buy in the underworld trafficking the arms that Hamas has acquired?
You ask, could it? Yes, it could, more easily than we might want to think, but I'm not going there because I have no proof of it at all. That would just be shocking to me that you'd wind up contributing to the deaths that happened on October the 7th yourself. I can't go that far.
Well, you remember Secretary of State Colin Powell when Bush and Cheney initiated the criminal invasion of Iraq, and you were right there in the State Department. He said something. He said, when you invade a country, you own it, which is another way of him saying you got to protect the civilian population under international law. And we'll learn more about the international law violations of the U.S. and Israel near the end of this program with Bruce Fein. What is Israel going to do if it invades and occupy, or because it doesn't want to be responsible for civilian population fleeing and destitute and dying, they just go in and do their work and then go out and then go in the next day? What do you see here?
Well, they've had this strategy for a long time of mowing the lawn, as they call it, just going in periodically and annihilating everyone. I go back to Operation Cast Lead. I had an IDF officer actually tell me that his battalion commander said to him as Operation Cast Lead was unfolding, kill everything that moves. Dogs, cats, babies, women, children, kill everything that moves. We are sending a signal this time. I have no doubt that that was probably an honest revelation by that particular IDF officer. So what comes after that, though, seems to be something Israel never contemplates very well or never comes up with a solution. It's hard for me to criticize them because we did the same thing in Iraq and the same thing in Afghanistan, less brutally perhaps, but nonetheless, we had no strategy in Iraq nor no strategy in Afghanistan. It was just kind of to stay there year after year after year, mow the lawn. So I don't know what Israel's going to do, but I'm not impressed with post-conflict times in the past. They don't seem to know what they're going to do. Who's going to govern Gaza?
When you were in on the strategy to invade Iraq, and you all were advising Bush and the White House and Cheney, did you ever talk to them about observing international law, the UN Charter?
First of all, you didn't advise Cheney. He advised you. Second, yes, Will Taft, our lawyer at State, was very vocal and very eloquent in explaining the obligations under the Geneva Conventions. for an occupying power and all the ancillary duties that went along with it. But Dick Cheney didn't listen to that sort of thing. Dick Cheney was like Netanyahu. Dick Cheney was all about let's get it done and get it over. And getting it done was let's kill the Taliban, let's kill Al-Qaeda, let's do whatever we have to do in Iraq to whoever opposes us and get it over with and get out. And oh, by the way, they wanted to do the same thing to Assad in Syria and the same thing to the Ayatollah and his boys, the IRGC in Iran. The only thing that stopped them was Iran did not cooperate. It was not a pushover. And an insurgency started, and they had to hang around because Bush ordered them to do so. No doubt in my mind that had Bush not ordered them to hang around, Cheney and Rumsfeld would have pushed the forces and made the president conduct the operation they wanted on into Syria and on into Iran. And we would have...
Did anybody tell Bush, for example, Mr. President, we do have to remind ourselves that when you go into Iraq under shock and awe, the slogan, there are going to be a lot of children, women, innocent men, mothers, fathers killed. And you have to take that into account. Did anybody put that human element in front of him?
Will Taft did, and so did Powell from time to time. But, I mean, you have Madeleine Albright saying, once she was asked, do you know that the sanctions kill hundreds, if not thousands, of Iraqi children? And she said, well, it was worth it. That's the way we think.
Actually, the figure was put to her by Leslie Stahl was 500,000 Iraqi children.
Don't doubt
right.
it.
Well, the overwhelming proportion of human beings in Gaza are children and women. Almost nearly half of the population of Gaza are children.
The casualties right now, the casualties that UNICEF is reporting amongst children are just staggering.
And this is what I want to ask you. It seems like given 8,000 missiles being used already against the civilian population and so-called military targets in Gaza, it's inconceivable that there are only 6,000 fatalities. I mean, they blew up apartment buildings. There are strikes by Israeli missiles that killed 60, 80 people, crowded marketplaces. Is it possible that Hamas is lowballing the fatality toll because they don't want to appear like they can't begin to protect their own people? There are people now dying from contaminated water, disease, the fear of a cholera epidemic, starvation, lack of medical care for injuries in hospitals, no medicines. Would you be surprised if the total death toll reaches 30, 40,000 within a couple of months?
Eventually, I would be surprised if it didn't go that high, because those things you ticked off laterally to the bombs, bullets, and bayonets, they kill more people. Usually on the battlefield and post-battlefield, the ratio's 10, 11, 12 to 1 in terms of those kinds of casualties, disease, water, the ruination that war causes, to the combat casualties. So you're going to add at least 10 for every one in combat for the aftermath and the disaster that comes in that aftermath.
How do you read the citizen temper here, if there is one?
I think we're perched on a very dangerous post right now. And I owe this idea or the conception for it to the Jewish community in New York. You know, there were more Jews in New York than there were in Israel till the Russians immigrated, but there's still a lot of Jews in New York, and most of them detest Netanyahu. And one of them said to me, without blinking an eye, the greatest motivator to anti-Semitism in the world is Bibi Netanyahu. They are very worried. They won't talk about this because they're afraid if they talk about it, they'll bring it to fruition. They're very worried that the American people, very noted for this sort of thing, will do a volte-face, a change of face at the last minute. And we'll wind up having attacks on synagogues all across the country, and anti-Semitism will be rampant. Let me tell you about the street I was on in Great Neck. The street runs north-south with 4 synagogues on it. Some are conservative, some are liberal, some are reformed. The light was so bright when I came out of the synagogue that you could see like daytime. And I asked the rabbi, I said, what's this? He said, that's the police. They're everywhere. The police are all around the synagogues because they fear. And I suspect they've actually had threats to get that kind of police protection. So it'll be a huge change, and it'll be almost instantaneous. You'll go to sleep on Monday night, and everything will be okay. And on Tuesday morning, you wake up and the majority of the American people will not have any use for the Jews in their midst. That is not a good development. But that's kind of the way we do things in this country these days. In fact, you go back to the past, it's the way we did things in the past often too. We make decisions based on almost groundless evidence, but a groundswell of opinion, and then suddenly it's an entirely different ballgame. That's a dangerous situation to be in. And of course, it extends to Europe. It extends all across the globe. However, what I'm seeing all across the globe, certainly 3 billion people, maybe more, is an absolute detesting of what we're doing right now, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. It's growing every day. Hundreds of people are converting in places like Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, and so forth, to hatred of the empire. That's not a good development either. It's one we will recognize too late and too little.
Well, there's fear on all sides. There's fear by Islamic Americans, by Palestinian Americans. They're being canceled events, literary events, 92nd Street Y, canceling events. They're being told to shut up at universities. They're losing their jobs just by saying on their social media that they want a humanitarian ceasefire. So there's a lot of imported censorship here.
Yes,
from the conflict over there.
Muslim anchors, being taken off their shows, Mehdi Hassan being the most notable one. Mehdi has been very outspoken.
Yeah, MSNBC's anchors, yes. And there's a lot going on. There's a prominent person working in creative artists in California, and she made the mistake of saying that she was for a humanitarian ceasefire, and she was pushed out, regardless of the client she brought to the firm. And of course, there are now corporations putting pressure, putting pressure on universities to stifle student dissent. And it's going to increasingly affect our country, not only in terms of finances and empires abroad, but it's going to deteriorate our own democratic society. You see that?
Yeah, it already has, and it proceeds apace daily.
We're talking with retired Colonel Larry Wilkerson, who until recently taught at William and Mary. He's taught at the Naval War College. He has networked former high-ranked military retired all over the country to argue for peace, for diplomacy, for an end to the empire, for controlling the runaway, unauditable Pentagon budget, and you're still doing it day after day, Larry. Well, the Israelis, year after year, the military and the politicians say that Israel does not target civilians. Your response?
That's the biggest nonsense I've ever heard, but I've heard so much nonsense coming out of Tel Aviv and now Jerusalem that I'm inured to it. And I've heard the same nonsense coming out of the White House and out of the Congress. Ralph, I testified before Elizabeth Warren's Personnel Subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee recently. I had to be berated by Democrat and Republican on that committee. The ranking member, Rick Scott from Florida, spent his entire opening remarks time berating me for calling Netanyahu a criminal, for being anti-Israel, in his words. Tim Kaine from Virginia, a Democrat, an otherwise relatively sane man, he had to get his licks in when it came his time because he was so afraid of the lobby. So afraid of the greatest foreign agent operating in our country, AIPAC, and its associated ancillaries. He was so afraid he had to get a lick in at me, too. You dare not criticize Israel if you're in front of the Congress.
What about the assertion that Hamas uses human shields?
I wouldn't put it past that to happen on occasion and a tactical necessity. They would say it was a necessity, but let's look at Israel's counterpart. Israel has now said it's rescinded this rule. Yeah, I hope it has. But they have this rule. I forget what they call it. It's some biblical term. If one of their soldiers is out there in front of the fight, which happens all the time when you're fighting urban warfare, if he's out there and he's interfering with the rest of the soldiers, you shoot and kill him. If he's apt to be captured, you shoot and kill him because he might divulge information under interrogation. So you shoot and kill him. It's called the Hannibal rule or something like that. But they disowned it recently in their own press because someone had made some to-do about it. But that's the IDF.
You think they've decided to sacrifice the hostages in Gaza?
I think Biden's one positive message, positive in the sense of the whole brutal war, was that don't do that. Don't do that. If I see you doing anything that I think is going to threaten those American lives in particular, but the hostages' lives in general, I think there are about, 197 or 198 left, then I'm going to have a really harsh conversation with you. I think Biden probably impressed that on Bibi. I don't know how much it'll work, but I hope it works at least a little bit, because we need to get those hostages back. And Hamas has shown that they're willing to work. And the Israelis have shown by past actions that they'll give up 6,000, I think it was, Hamas prisoners for a couple of Israeli soldiers. So if you're willing that much to protect your own citizens, then certainly here you ought to be able to work some exchanges. And let's get them out of the way before everything turns so brutal that they're impossible.
Any chance for a short truce, like in 2014, for a prisoner exchange?
Well, the Israelis,
in a sense of exchanging hostages for some of the 8,000 Palestinians languishing in Israeli jails, many of them youngsters, without any due process or even charges against them. Any chance there?
I don't know. I hope there is, but the Israelis have been fairly adamant that there be no ceasefire, because Hamas will gain if there's a ceasefire. And I think we've been backing them in that so far. I think if it came up for a real sizable and understandable exchange, that is to say, the circumstances suggested and everything were proper and right and could be secured, that'd be a game changer for Biden. And he would intervene and he'd say, let's do this. Let's do this. They've offered to give 100 hostages back at this point, at this time, and in exchange for whatever, let's do it. I think he'd have to do that, because it might break and get in the press, and then what would he look like?
Well, a decision by the Israeli military to go and wipe out the tunnels, they can do that with flooding, with gas, with napalm. But if they do, they're going to destroy the hostages as well.
I said yesterday on another show, I said, this is the most difficult form of warfare, urban warfare, no question about it. But if you are honorable, if you are operating in accordance with the rules of war, Geneva Conventions and other things, land combat warfare, the rules of land combat, you will sacrifice your soldiers to obey that law. So you go painstakingly through the process. You don't use wholesale means to kill people indiscriminately. You don't kill hostages. Maybe they die in the process, but you aren't responsible for it. You are willing to risk 3 or 4 of your people being wounded or even killed in order to conform with the law. I don't see Israel in that guise, though. I see them as not giving a damn about humanitarian law or the law of land warfare. So that's bad. That's bad. It's bad for the hostages, too, if they're allowed to carry it out that way. I just hope we tell them you can't do that or you're risking our support. That'd be a first for us, but I'd like to see that first.
Well, there's a precedent. President Eisenhower in 1956, when the Israelis, French, and British Air Force were attacking Egypt over Sinai, he just stood up and said to them, stop. And they did stop. Biden's not willing to do that.
No, when he's not Dwight Eisenhower. We had a president then.
David?
How catastrophic an intelligence failure was this for Netanyahu? And could you give us some insight into decision-making processes that are clouded by shame? George W. Bush must have been humiliated after 9/11. Security was his calling card, and it happened on his watch. Security was Netanyahu's calling card. So how does shame cloud their judgment moving forward?
Majorly. Bush actually convened a meeting in the Oval Office with Franklin Graham and some other evangelicals. And in his meeting with a few of us later, he essentially said, he told them, I'm full of rage. Help me control that rage. I'm a Christian. I need to control that rage. I don't think he did that good a job of it. And I don't think Netanyahu will probably do that good a job of it. It doesn't seem to be doing that good a job of it. And there was also, as you intimated in your question, a real fabric for about 24 hours around the White House of, wow, this exceeds Pearl Harbor. Will the American people throw us out? And then suddenly they began, as Washington failed to really evacuate itself, that's what the president said to do, because we couldn't evacuate everybody methodically. the American people seem to kind of be in shock, but then they kind of gel behind a few things that came out of the administration. And whoa, all of a sudden they realize we can get them back if we've lost them. All we got to do is appear like we're really angry and doing something. And so when Colin will talk to the vice president and president about, hey, when you do war against these terrorists, there's some drawbacks. One, you're going to elevate them to warrior status. Two, you're going to increase the executive power to the point where things might get out of hand. Boy, did they get out of hand. AT&T, Verizon, and everybody else joining in to get them out of hand. But it was a troubled time, and you have a hard time managing yourself during these troubled times, and no one really tried to on our side. It was a long time before we started thinking rationally again.
Anna?
What is the most accurate way to refer to the conflict? I remember being taught to refer to it as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the language seems to paint them as combatants in a level war. What is the most accurate way to refer to the situation? Is it conflict? Is it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or is there a more appropriate term?
You know, we wrestled with this one, and we made really bad decisions calling them unlawful combatants and all other terms that we came up with in order to try and assuage the fact we had left Geneva, our own creation, really. They're guerrillas. They're guerrillas fighting back against a super modern military who don't have tanks, who don't have armored personnel carriers, who don't have all the sophisticated weaponry that they're up against. And so they're using guerrilla tactics. They're time immemorial. They've been around forever. And we've invented all these terms, unlawful combatants, and we love terrorists. Well, 3 billion people in the world think the biggest terrorist in the world lives in Washington. 2 billion think it's absolutely non-debatable that the biggest terrorist lives in Washington. So one man's terrorist, to quote Ronald Reagan, is another man's freedom fighter, and vice versa. The way to look, I think, at this conflict right now is unconscionable, violative of every rule of war in the book, violative of humanitarian decency, and one-sided to the maximum. The same way you would look at, as I said before, the extermination of the Native Americans in the Black Hills in order for gold miners to get in there.
Just to elaborate your point for people who don't have the context, the war in Iraq killed over 1 million Iraqi civilians, and they're still dying from the destitution and the disease and the untreated injuries.
In a diaspora, either internally displaced or somewhere else outside Iraq's borders. We killed 2.5 million, maybe more. There's a verdict not really in firmly yet. In Vietnam, we dropped more iron bombs on North Vietnam than we dropped on Nazi Germany in World War II. You know, what's terror? It's clear to me.
Yeah, and there's Libya, there's supporting the Saudis in Yemen, there's the overreaction in Afghanistan, to put it mildly. For 20 years, civilians dying, children, women, men, families. Yeah, I mean, we've got a great capability of turning our back on what are clearly violations of international law, the Geneva Conventions, even our own Constitution. These are not declared wars, even though they're wars.
But Josh Paul, the State Department individual who just voted with his conscience, is just the tip of the iceberg as to what the United States has been doing with its armaments shipped to Israel.
Talk about Josh Paul, the State Department official who was responsible for arms transfers and security assistance to foreign governments for a number of years, who quit just recently.
Yeah, he quit on moral grounds, ethical grounds. And I've been there. I saw some of the things Israel was doing with our equipment, and most of the equipment we give them under FMS or whatever methodology we give them the equipment comes with a caveat. And the caveat says, essentially, if you're killing men, women, and children with it, we'll take it back, or we'll censure you, or, do something at least. Hell, we rarely ever even demarche them when they would do something with it. It was just the order of the day. It was business. I'm told right now, I hope this is true. Josh is not the only one. I'm told the dissent channel at the State Department, which is a way clear to the secretary for any foreign service officer, I think they extended it to the civil service now too, to send in a dissent. And the secretary must look at it That's the ruling. I'm told that that channel is so clogged with messages into the secretary that Blinken couldn't read them all if he tried and isn't trying. I'm told that they're putting a squash on it, and they may even cancel the dissent channel or suspend it for a period of time because it's overwhelmed with people registering their disdain for American foreign policy.
Well, in case some listeners are still skeptical here about the equities, hold on a few minutes until Bruce Fein comes on, and he'll quote the famous, oft-quoted remark by David Ben-Gurion, the founder of Israel, first prime minister, seen by Israelis as the George Washington of their country. And you'll see his comment to Nahum Goldman, then head of the World Zionist Organization, in just a few minutes. Francesco, your comment or question?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Colonel Wilkerson, a two-state solution no longer seems possible. And so where do we go from here? What could a contemporary peace deal look like? A lot of people have brought up the idea of a single binational state with equal rights. And is that a realistic goal?
I think the two-state solution should be forced on them, both sides, forced on them. I think it ought to be like Cyprus. It ought to be like Kashmir. It ought to be like the Korean Peninsula and a number of other places around the world. I don't care if it lasts for 75 years, like Cyprus has, I think. Korean Peninsula says 53. We should divide the territory in accordance with UN Resolution 242. We should put the Palestinians on their side, the Israelis on their side. Let them figure out if the Palestinians who are living inside Israel, some of whom have Israeli citizenship, move or not. That's an individual decision. Put a UN force in perpetuity between them and tell them live with it, or we'll shoot from the UN force both directions and, enforce it. That's what we need to do. That's what we need to do. Another possibility, I work with every other Sunday with Joseph Assafar. It's called the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, and we have all manner of people on there, Knesset members. We have people currently citizens of Israel, currently citizens of Palestine, Gaza, or wherever, East Jerusalem, and they come on and they express their views and everything, and we vote on issues. We put a government over, it was over PA, Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and Israel. And each of those entities has veto power over legislation we pass. But we conduct elections in the 14 million or so people between the river and the sea. And those elections put in place a president, vice president, and a 300-member parliament. And we take over gradually lots of things like enforcement of security of the different borders and checkpoints and so forth. We take over education. We take over all manner. We vote every other Sunday on these issues and this legislation. And many times we have people, most often Israelis, who veto it, sometimes Palestinians of both stripes, PA and Hamas. But that's another possible solution. People think it's pie in the sky, but if you could get this umbrella federal government, if you will, over the three entities, now I guess two, and enforce legislation over time, you could probably create a single state that was democratic. We were just getting ready. Right before October 7th, we had built a sign. The sign cost $30,000. The sign says in big, huge letters, a Jewish state is not good for Jews. We had permission of the Israeli government. We were going to put it up in Tel Aviv for 30 days on a main avenue. That's off now, of course. But that just tells you there are possibilities if we just don't give up.
Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. We've been talking with retired Colonel Larry Wilkerson. Any last comment you want to make before we close?
I'm not a religious man normally, but I tell you what, I've taken to praying. This is a tragic situation, and one we have had every hand in making.
Thank you very much, Larry Wilkerson. To be continued.
Thank you, Ralph, and all of you.
We've been speaking with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com, and we will also link to the Josh Paul State Department op-ed from the Washington Post on our Substack site. Up next, we'll talk to Bruce Fein about the international legal implications of the U.S. participation in support of Israel. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, October 27, 2023. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Police are investigating possible corporate manslaughter charges at the hospital where serial killer Lucy Letby worked. That's according to a report from the BBC. The former nurse, 33, was jailed in August for murdering 7 babies and attempting to kill 6 others at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Chester police said the latest investigation was in its early stages. Lawyers representing some of the victims' families said they were reassured steps were being taken to consider the actions of management. Organizations and companies can be found guilty of corporate manslaughter in the UK as a result of serious management failures resulting in gross breach of duty of care under the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act of 2007. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph and Hannah and Francesco and the rest of the team. Let's talk to Bruce Fein about international law in relation to what's going on between Israel and Gaza. David?
Bruce Fein is a constitutional scholar and an expert on international law. Mr. Fein was Associate Deputy Attorney General under Ronald Reagan, and he has argued before the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court at The Hague. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bruce Fein.
Thank you, Bruce, for coming on. There's a legality issue here if we believe in the rule of law and international rules of orderly jurisprudence that you have looked into in terms of your experience and all. And we both sent a letter to President Biden a few days ago outlining it because we took note of the several times he cautioned Israeli leaders after October 7th, quote, to operate by the laws of war, end quote. How is the United States and Israel operating by the laws of war?
Well, Ralph, it's a wonderful question, and I think the audience would be informed to receive a little bit of a background because it's often said, this is just Israel responding in self-defense. They have no other course of action, and therefore everything they're doing is au Quran. And this is a quote from David Ben-Gurion. He was kind of the George Washington of Israel. He was the first prime minister. He was lionized for decades before he finally retired after decades in the Israeli government. And this is his quote from the head of the World Zionist Organization. It's not a quote that is reported by Hamas, among others. Quote, if I were an Arab leader, Ben-Gurion said, I would never sign an agreement with Israel. It is normal. We have taken their country. It is true, God promised it to us, but how could that interest them? Our God is not theirs. There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? They see but one thing. We have come and stolen their country. Why would they accept that? End quote. So this is reported by the head of the World Zionist Organization. To be a Zionist is someone who believes that there ought to be a state of Israel, a nation for Jews. So that gives you, I think, an understanding of the dynamics, the clash between the largely Arab, Muslim, Christians and the Jews and that neighborhood, if you will. For anybody in the audience who would like to verify this was taken from a Nahum Goldman book called Jewish Paradox, page 121, published by Grosset and Dunlap. And I'm not getting a commission for any purchases that you make. The publication year is 1978.
What have been the violations of international law?
So in summary, here's what the landscape looks like. The United States now itself has become guilty of violating the laws of war, the ones that Biden himself said should be the operational norm for Israel. How has he done that? He's given systematically weapons and military intelligence and financial support to Israel to commit the crime of genocide against Palestinians by creating conditions of life calculated to destroy the group, in part by becoming a co-belligerent, giving weapons that are used to kill vastly disproportionate number of civilian Palestinians compared to any legitimate military objective. He's used as a co-belligerent the military weapons that help to require forcible relocation of more than 1 million, I think at least 1 million Gazans in North Gaza to South Gaza. That's forcible relocation being a violation of law of war. And then he's engaged in what I'd call going and using and assisting Israel in using the weapons and his military intelligence to go vastly beyond any right of self-defense, which is permitted under Article 51 of the United Nations. And at that point, it becomes a violation of the prohibition of aggressive war. So you put all that together, and it really is it's almost laughable to have the President of the United States stand up there and proclaim as the fundamental principle of U.S. international foreign policy is make it a rule-based international order, as he's violating the orders himself. And that's why we end up with blowback.
Thank you very much, Bruce Fein, for your observations on the current scene and always upholding the international rule of law, without which we have wars of aggression, we have empire, we have terrible courses of violence around the world, which is why the rule of law is something that has to be more than just lip service. It has to be deep in the veins of our foreign and diplomatic policies abroad. Thank you.
I want to thank our guests again, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson and Bruce Fein. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis. And, in case you haven't heard, a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
Saturday, October 28th is Tort Law Education Day at the American Museum of Tort Law. Join Ralph Saturday, October 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern for the museum's free virtual panel on Why Don't People Sue? Go to tortmuseum.org to register. And if you missed the live event, go to tortmuseum.org to view the live recording. And remember, to continue the conversation after each show, go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode. We read them all.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is the indefatigable Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you. And if you want a Department of Peace in our government in Washington, Congressman Jim McGovern is the most likely one to introduce the bill. We have a Department of War. We don't have a Department of Peace. We don't wage peace. We don't work on conflict avoidance. So get in touch with Jim McGovern, Democrat from Massachusetts. Call him up and urge him to put that bill in so we can have hearings and all those good peace groups all over the country can have a rallying point. Thank you.